All right, so this is kind of a revival of a series I used to do on my personal YouTube channel, Abcadeas, excuse me, just called Coffee Time. And I'm just going to call this Abcadeas Coffee. I'm not sure if this will be the only video I ever make or if this will become a series. But essentially, that series was just me sitting down in front of my phone camera and ranting about a particular issue and kind of just going on a tangent. And I wanted to revive that and kind of evolve it in a way, up the production value just a smidge, and present you with what I'm doing here. So today, I wanted to speak on specifically the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and I wanted to kind of frame this as what we're looking at going forward, what the future of this conflict is. And I just want to put all opinions, whether you support Ukraine, whether you support Russia aside, or you're like myself and you support primarily the people of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics that have been fighting for sovereignty for 8 years and have been ignored despite signing the Minsk II agreements. I want to put all of that aside, and I just want to look at facts, mainly reports coming out of Western news outlets. There's one report I want to look at from a Russian news outlet, but it's quoting the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov. So I think it's a pretty reliable source on that particular piece of information. But without any further ado, I guess we'll just jump in here. So like I said, the first article I wanted to talk about is from TASS, a Russian news agency, talking specifically, quoting something from Sergei Lavrov. So now this is based on what seemed to be a big diplomatic development in the conflict in Ukraine. So initially you had... I won't go over the article, I'll show it to you. You had this interview that Anthony Blinken had with David Ignatius over at the Washington Post. Obviously, it's paywalled, so I can't go through it, but Alexander Mercouris provided a great breakdown, quoting that article directly of essentially what Blinken was saying. And what Blinken was saying is he's looking at creating a peace proposal, and in that peace proposal, the three main points are that Russia will give back all of the territory gained after February 2022, that the question of Crimea's political future will remain up for debate, that it will be decided at a later date, and that Crimea will be demilitarized. And then the last point was that Ukraine cannot join NATO, but can still receive Western weapons and arms. And now, aside from the idea that the Russians would never agree to any of this, the main thing to point out here is that the US is moving for negotiations. This hasn't happened since March 22, when there were peace negotiations in Istanbul, and Putin, as a gesture of good faith, pulled the troops out of Kyiv. As a reaction to that, Boris Johnson shows up in Kyiv, and all of a sudden, the peace negotiations in Istanbul fall apart. What a coincidence. Since then, the US has not seriously even tried to engage in any kind of dialogue with the Russians. Actually, basically in the first time in US-Russian relations, there is no direct line of communication between the Americans and the Russians. Even during the height of the Cold War, there was still a direct line between the president and Moscow to avoid nuclear Armageddon, like they did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But now those don't exist. Two of the biggest nuclear superpowers in the world are not communicating with each other. But there is this peace agreement that was floated that most likely Russia won't agree to, and I'm basing that off of what Mr. Sergei Lavrov said. So back to that, I wanted to kind of start at this point in the article and just read out to you a bit of what Lavrov said. We have had one more message from Egypt's foreign minister has handed over to us to the effect that Russia should stop, that Russia should quit, and then everything will be fine. English translation there, I think, is a tad shaky, but you get what he's saying. Lavrov went on to say, adding that at the same time, Blinken omitted something. The other part of the message, showing the true interest of the United States and the West, was stated by NATO Secretary General Mr. Jens Stoltenberg when he was in the Republic of Korea yesterday. And note that Lavrov is using the actual official designation of South Korea, much like how North Korea is actually officially called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, regardless of how much you may disagree with that designation. That is their official, legal, diplomatic designation. Much like the designation for South Korea is officially the Republic of Korea, and that's how Lavrov refers to it here. He goes on to say, he said in one of his speeches, now talking about Jens Stoltenberg, that Russia must lose, must be defeated, and that the West cannot afford to let Ukraine lose, because in that case, he argued, the West will lose and the whole world will lose. So, on the surface, what Mr. Jens Stoltenberg is insinuating with that comment is that if Russia is able to defeat Ukraine, that they are going to make this move against Eastern Europe and continue all the way to London, is essentially what he's insinuating there. But I don't personally believe that's even what Jens Stoltenberg himself believes. I think he knows that a failure or a military debacle in Ukraine that results in a Russian victory will irreversibly damage the reputation of NATO and Western countries as a whole. He knows that the entire world is watching this specific conflict, and with the way the West has driven the narrative that the Russian military is completely incompetent, it's failed miserably at every step in the way, and it's done nothing but send human waves of thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths, and that Ukraine has destroyed thousands of Russian tanks and captured hundreds more, and despite that, they are still begging for tanks and heavy weaponry, and they are getting less than 200, which, by the way, they started this conflict with about 1,000 Soviet-era tanks, and were given several hundreds more by former Warsaw Pact countries. But now, despite having captured all these Russian tanks, apparently, and being having a hold of all these Soviet-era tanks previously, despite that, Ukraine is still begging for more arms and more weapons. So I don't understand how that can really be squared, that Ukraine is winning, Ukraine is doing all this great stuff, but hasn't moved an inch since the Kherson and Kharkov offensives back in the autumn of 2022. That the Russians have been steadily gaining ground, maybe only a few meters at a time, but the Russians have not lost any significant ground since the autumn. And what we're supposed to believe is that Ukraine is implacably winning, not implacably, they're undoubtedly winning this war. And I don't know if I quite believe that, to be honest. Like, feel free. Brian Berletic of the New Atlas is a great source that goes over military specifics. He's a former U.S. Marine. He has a good knowledge of how these individual weapon systems actually operate, not only individually, but as a larger squadron or part of a battalion tactical group. And how they operate in combined arms warfare. He talks about these things all the time on his channel. If you're really interested in getting into the nitty-gritty military specifics of this conflict, I cannot recommend him highly enough. So that brings me to my next point, and the next article I want to share with you. So shortly before this visit from Mr. Blinken, there is two United States think tanks, or American think tanks, I should say, that came out with studies, policy papers, whatever you want to call them, basically talking about the war in Ukraine and its long-term effects and the possible outcomes therein. One is from the RAND Corporation, one is from CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. first, I just wanted to go over a couple points I had already highlighted in this Rand Corporation report. I'll make sure to leave all the links in the description so you can take a look for yourself. So the first thing I wanted to get into with this particular study is its stated purpose. So it is an American think tank. It is definitely not pro-Russian. It is definitely not anti-Ukrainian. But it states here, it is appropriate to assess how the conflict may evolve, what alternative trajectories might mean for U.S. interests, and what Washington can do to promote a trajectory that best serves U.S. interests. So, while this study does acknowledge the effect that some of the decisions that they're proposing, they acknowledge the effect that those might have on Ukraine, its economy, and its future as a nation, it is not primarily concerned with that. This study, as well as the one from CSIS, are both primarily concerned with the effect this conflict will have on the United States of America itself. So, the next point I wanted to go over is talking about the possibility of a direct NATO-Russian conflict, and it's speaking specifically about the likelihood of Russia attacking NATO. Some analysts are doubtful that Russia would attack a NATO country since it is already losing ground to Ukrainian forces and would find itself in a war with the world's most powerful alliance. So I think a bit of a citation is needed for both things there. You can go to the citation they have there, but it doesn't really back up the claims that Russia is currently losing ground, like I said, since the Kherson and Kharkov offensives in the late autumn. Ukrainians haven't gained any ground. The Russians have gained very modest, very small amounts of ground, but they aren't losing ground. Even Western analysts agree that at this point, the momentum is kind of shifting in Russia's favor. And then the second thing I kind of want to hem and haw about with that is calling NATO the world's most powerful alliance. I mean, I guess if you don't consider Russia, China, and India having a possible military alliance, obviously India isn't involved militarily with either of those countries right now, but as it continues to be involved with the BRICS treaties and this move away from American hegemony and unipolarity, India is a lot more likely to ally with Russia and China than it ever will be to ally with the United States. And right there, you're looking at two of the most populous nations in the world. You're talking about almost half the world's population. And you're telling me 13% of the world's population, roughly the portion of the population that resides in Western countries, you're telling me that is the most powerful military alliance? Okay, sure, whatever, let's move on. I'm not going to debate the veracity of that because I don't have these specifics to go into that. But the next point I wanted to go into is, as the study slowly admits, the intensity of the military assistance effort could also become unsustainable after a certain period. Already, European and some U.S. stocks of weapons are reportedly running low. And now, I have seen an article, I'll try to take a look for it a little bit as I talk, but specifically talking about the fact that the U.S. industrial complex, the U.S. military in general, has given up on the idea that it will be able to keep up with Russia in terms of artillery shell production. This isn't even getting into the shortages of Patriot or HIMARS missiles, or the fact that it's going to take a month to produce at least 15 Abrams tanks, most likely longer than that. Specifically, this article, I didn't link it in my source doc, so I'm going to try to find it, but it specifically said, it was a Washington Street Journal report, and it was saying that that Ukraine fires about 40,000 artillery shells a month, and that is a result of the United States only being able to produce about 100,000 artillery shells per year, on top of what other NATO countries can produce and what are already in existing military stockpiles. that is making it so the Ukrainians can fire about 40,000 shells a month. On the flip side, the Russians, as well as the forces of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics and the Chechen and Wagner forces, collectively, they are firing 20,000 shells a day. Pretty big difference. So, unfortunately, I can't find that specific article right now, but I'll make sure to find it after I'm done recording and provide it in the description down below. But anyways, back to the Rand Corporation study. And the next thing, the main thing I wanted to point out about this particular study is its insistence for the need to shift away from this conflict so the US can focus on its other adversary, China. So the report goes on to say, beyond the potential for Russian gains and economic consequences for Ukraine, Europe, and the world, a long war would also have consequences for the US foreign policy. The US ability to focus on other global priorities, particularly competition with China, will remain constrained as long as the war is absorbing senior policymakers' time and US military resources. And then later on in the report, it goes on to say, in short, the consequences of a long war, ranging from persistent elevated escalation risks to economic damage, far outweigh the possible benefits. So you can go ahead and read the body of this study for yourself and go over all the specifics, but basically what this study is saying in conclusion is that the US and its Western allies cannot continue to support the war in Ukraine. Period. That it is time to move on to other endeavors. It is time to focus on China. And that brings me to another article, particularly from the Washington Post, speaking of specifically what a U.S. general said, predicting war with China by 2025. So we pull out of Afghanistan, that ends in a complete debacle, just in time for the Ukraine conflict to flare up. And now we need to tone down the Ukraine conflict so the Taiwan conflict has time to flare up. Wonder if there's a pattern there. But anyways, I kind of wanted to read just one or two statements really from this. So the article goes on to say, open conflict between China and the United States could be just 2 years away, according to an unusually blunt memo by a top U.S. general that is just the latest in a number of alarming predictions that the world's two leading military powers are at risk of direct collision, most likely over the fate of Taiwan. And the second thing I'm going to point out here is the CSIS study that says much the same thing. It goes on to say, the U.S. defense industrial base is not adequately prepared for the international security environment that now exists. In a major regional conflict, such as a war with China in the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. use of munitions would likely exceed the current stockpiles of the U.S. Department of Defense. According to the results of a series of CSIS war games, the United States would likely run out of some munitions, such as long-range, precision-guided missiles, in less than 1 week in a Taiwan Strait conflict. The war in Ukraine has also exposed serious deficiencies in the U.S. defense industrial base and serves as a stark reminder that a protracted conflict is likely to be an industrial war that requires a defense industry able to manufacture enough munitions, weapon systems, and materiel to replace depleted stockpiles. So again, another article saying the U.S. doesn't have the capacity to keep up this war with Ukraine and move on to China. Quite frankly, that article admits that the U.S. doesn't even have the capacity to go to war with China, period, even directly, saying that it will run out of precision-guided missiles in a week. That is pretty insane that they are even considering going to war with Taiwan. Those missiles, by the way, the U.S. military industrial complex isn't producing them to the tune of thousands and thousands a year, by the way. I'm not sure what the number is, but I know it's not enough from now till 2025 to restock the U.S. stockpiles. The other thing is, the Russians and the Chinese are in a direct military cooperative agreement. I won't quite say alliance because they don't have the traditional alliance that if anybody attacks you, I will attack them, like we saw in the First and Second World Wars. Rather, their militaries cooperate and have several training exercises and coordinate several things on a large scale. And now, most of these long-range, precision-guided missile systems that the U.S. has, aside from the ATACMS missile system and I believe one or two others, but most of these systems have been put into the battlefield in Ukraine, the HIMARS missile systems and the Patriot missile systems. And Russia, well, it did serve a pretty not devastating, but a pretty significant blow at first. The Russian forces were able to adapt, overcome. They were able to research the technology. They were able to capture a couple HIMARS launchers. They were able to reverse engineer it. And they have a plan on how to counter HIMARS missiles. And if you think that information hasn't been shared with the Chinese military, well, as Alexander Mercouris would say, I have a bridge to sell you. But nonetheless, the point is, the U.S. is pushing towards not only a direct conflict with Russia, but a direct conflict with China at a time that it does not have the capacity to do so. And you see this kind of air of resignation, maybe, within the U.S. establishment itself, or perhaps more so coming from the European nations, that there has to at least be some off-ramp, some path to peace opened up in terms of negotiations with the Russians. Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, stood very firmly on not sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, but shortly after he folded and walked right past the red line that he himself drew, he said publicly that we do have to look at reaching a peaceful resolution for this conflict. But what Blinken has brought, as I explained, is going to be completely implacable to the Russians. Blinken, I think, knew this. I think it's more so a move to quiet and satisfy European leaders and generals that have been speaking on the poor state of their own militaries for quite some time now. But ultimately, this is all leading us down a very dark path. So I wanted to kind of delve into more of a hypothetical here. So far, the West, every time they have drawn a red line, they said they weren't going to send self-propelled howitzers. They sent them. Said they weren't going to send HIMARS missile systems. They sent them. Said they would never send Patriot missile systems. They sent them. Said they would never send Western-made battle tanks. They're going to send them. They're in the process of sending them right now. And with that, the Germans say, we will not send F-16s. And they also say, we will not send German troops. That almost doesn't sound like a red line to me as much as a prediction, as every other red line they've drawn has been deliberately overstepped to maintain this conflict in Ukraine. So my question is, we send the tanks, they get blown up. We send the F-16s, maybe a couple more tanks, so the Ukrainians have a bit of a chance at some combined arms warfare. They get destroyed. I know the training and the logistical supply routes and actually getting the equipment, building the equipment, refurbishing the equipment, all that stuff is going to take a number of years. But let's just assume that Ukraine can get it in a couple months. So F-16s go in. For one, they can't be operated out of any Ukrainian airfield. With the Russians maintaining air superiority over the entire country, it is not going to be even able to take off from a Ukrainian airfield. So that forces them to use Polish airfields which then become legitimate military targets for Russia. If Russia attacks one of those airfields, Poland can invoke Article 5, and we're looking at a direct conflict with NATO and Russia. Alternatively, say F-16s don't get sent, but we're looking at a Ukrainian military collapse, and you're looking at the 100,000 mobilized troops on the Polish border moving into Western Ukraine, moving into Galicia. You can see that while the Russians most likely don't want Western Ukraine for themselves, and Putin has even hinted in the past at giving that region or allowing Poland to take that region, you have the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, speaking specifically that if there is a Polish invasion and Poland is essentially expanding its border with Belarus, that Belarus will retaliate. And because of the relationship that Belarus and Russia maintain, that means Russia has to attack Poland as well. And generally, with Article 5 of the NATO Constitution, I believe it is, if a nation comes to the aid of another nation, it effectively waives Article 5. But, in my opinion, as we've seen through this entire conflict, the Western powers, NATO, do not play by actually any set of rules. Excuse me. They just kind of do as they please. So Article 5 or not, if the Western countries view this as enough of an existential threat, we're looking at a Third World War type of scenario, NATO versus Russia. Okay? So to continue on this hypothetical, I'm not saying this is likely, but we have NATO boots on the ground. They're fighting Russian soldiers and soldiers of Luhansk, Donetsk, People's Republics, Chechen, Wagner forces, all these groups. Belarusian forces most likely. And say these NATO forces are losing and are getting pushed back, and it looks like they're going to lose the whole of Ukraine. Do the Western powers even have the ability to come to the negotiating table? Do they even have the mechanisms? This gets talked about a lot by a lot of analysts I see, particularly Scott Ritter. There are some things about Scott Ritter that I don't like, but his analysis in regards to this particular conflict is by far unmatched. He is a former UN's weapons inspector and U.S. Marine, and he was actually there to negotiate the disarmament treaty between the Soviet Union and the United States. And one thing he mentions quite often is that diplomacy is like a muscle. If it's not used, it will atrophy. As the Russians and Americans haven't engaged in any kind of serious negotiations for decades now, you don't have any diplomats on the American side that I don't even think they know what negotiation is. They don't understand the concept of having to give things up in exchange to get things you want. I think they are so used to a U.S. foreign policy that says you either agree with us or you get flattened into the ground. And I mean, that worked out great in Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Kuwait. I mean, the list goes on. But if this war gets to that point, which I think it is likely to, but will the Western powers actually be able to negotiate, or are they going to hit the nuclear button? It's terrifying to think about, because the other thing is, if the Russian forces were to repel NATO forces off of Ukrainian territory, that would at that point be Russian territory. But if they were to successfully do that, and the NATO forces are continuing to wage counteroffensives and to continue to attack Russia, the Russian forces, the Russian Security Council, will drive all the way to London if it needs to. But it has absolutely no desire to do that. It is not in Russia's best interest to do that. And Russia, I get the impression that they genuinely want to avoid a direct conflict with NATO as much as possible. And I'm very specifically saying Russia here and not Vladimir Putin, because, well, Russia may be an authoritarian country, and you can argue that all day. Putin, much like any other wise leader, listens to his generals and lets them make decisions. Putin isn't making step-by-step military decisions, as well as overall political military decisions, like in terms of the mobilization. Putin actually faced a lot of criticism for not mobilizing fast enough, not mobilizing hard enough, and waiting till the war got to the point that they basically had no other option. While there is some dissent in Russia against the war, most of the dissenting opinion in Russia is that Putin has been too soft, too naive in the idea that he believes that the West can actually come to some kind of reasonable agreement or security agreement. Putin was begging since the Munich conference in 2008 for a comprehensive security framework to be created that accounted for both European and Russian security interests, and he's been trampled on since. I say him specifically because he's the one that specifically went to that conference. But the Russian Security Council, the Russian generals, ministers, they all look at this, and they look at the actions that have taken place over the course of the last 15 years, and they don't see that there is anybody that they can even speak to in the West. There is nobody they can trust. Angela Merkel was the closest to that, but she even admitted that the Minsk Accords or agreements, sorry, I can't remember what exactly they're referred to as, but she admitted that those were basically just a farce. That it was to keep the Russians happy, to make them think that there will be some genuine, democratically decided diplomatic resolution to Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic and their question of autonomy, which, by the way, they did hold referendums that were overwhelmingly in support of becoming autonomous from Ukraine. But nevertheless, those were ignored, and Ukrainian forces continued to shell the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic for 8 years. And still, to this day, Ukrainian forces are shelling the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. But with all that, I don't know if the Russians are even going to be willing to negotiate or willing to listen to any proposal the United States has. There is nobody in the West that can directly communicate with Russia. There is no trust between any Russian official and any Western official. It doesn't exist. Merkel making that admission that the Minsk II agreements were a complete farce, as well as a former Ukrainian official coming out and confirming that the peace negotiations in Istanbul that happened back in March, him also agreeing that they were a farce. These two events are the biggest gift that could have been given to the Russian war machine, because both of these things absolutely prove everything Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, his spokesman, have been saying since this conflict started. And by started, I mean back in 2014 after the Maidan coup. They have been saying that this is a conflict between the West and Russia. And that was confirmed, I believe, by Annalena Baerbock in the German parliament when they said, we are at war with Russia. And while that might have been a slip of the tongue, and she might not have meant to say it, and other German officials backtracked on those comments as hard as they could, there is no putting the cat back in the bag. More and more, the Russian public are coming to the conclusion that there is no negotiating with the West. The ones that disagree or dissented against the Russian government in terms of being involved in this conflict to begin with, those people have either moved to Georgia, Eastern Europe, parts of the West, or they have changed their opinion and they're now more of the opinion that there is no turning back. This is German tanks showing up on former Soviet territory where Stefan Bandera, a Ukrainian, a collaborator with a certain regime in Germany in the 30s and 40s, where once again, German tanks will be going across that territory and fighting Russian soldiers. If the Russians were making things up, I don't think they can make propaganda that's as effective as German tanks once again rolling across Soviet soil, former Soviet soil. That has brought the Russian people together to an immeasurable degree. And if you don't believe me, there's a particular interview on the Duran. I'll see if I can find it here. But it was with an individual that specifically lives in Russia as well. If you want to take a further look, there's lots of Telegram channels. There's lots of articles. I believe John Helmer was one of them, was an individual that visited Russia directly, and he had some of an opinion of what the Russian people are actually looking at in terms of their views for the around this particular conflict. Right here, the escalation escalator with iEarlGrey is an individual living in Russia with a Russian wife. I would encourage you to watch that live stream from the Duran if you want to get a better sense of what Russian people are thinking in Russia. But I guess one more thing I just wanted to point out to kind of hammer in my point, I guess, is another article from the Washington Post. Time is not on Ukraine's side. And specifically here, I wanted to read out this paragraph. It starts with a bit of nonsense, but it gets to the point eventually. So it goes on to say, meanwhile, although Ukraine's response to the invasion has become heroic and its military has performed brilliantly, the country's economy is in shambles. Millions of people have fled, its infrastructure is being destroyed, and much of its mineral wealth, industrial capacity, and considerable agricultural land are under Russian control. Ukraine's military capability and economy are now dependent almost entirely on lifelines from the West, primarily the United States. Good thing the United States isn't looking at any economic troubles on the horizon, hey? Anyways, back to the article. Absent another major Ukrainian breakthrough and success against Russian forces, Western pressures on Ukraine to negotiate a ceasefire will grow as months of military stalemate pass. I don't really believe there's a stalemate. Again, you look at liveuamap.com, and if you've been paying attention to this conflict for the last year, like I have, you can see pretty plainly that since the Kherson and Kharkov offensives in autumn, the Russians have not been losing ground. They have been steadily gaining ground. So while it may be a very slow process, and they are doing it very gradually and very methodically, I would not call it a stalemate, but I'll leave that for the political experts. Under current circumstances, any negotiated ceasefire would leave Russian forces in a strong position to resume their invasion whenever they are ready. That is unacceptable. So essentially, what this Washington Post article is saying, Ukraine can't keep up this conflict. Ukraine can't negotiate. What are the other options? Alexander Mercouris put it really well. I'm not sure if he was quoting a particular individual when he said this. I would have to find it in his particular video, but I definitely agree with what he said. And he said there's basically three options for the outcome of this war. First one is military debacle. So Russia wins, Ukraine ceases to exist as a nation. The US, NATO, and its Western allies look absolutely horrible on the world stage. I don't think the West is emotionally capable of having that happen. Second option, World War III, and all that implies. Third option is a peace settlement. But as you can see, the Americans and Russians are nowhere close to a peace agreement. And by the way, it should eliminate any doubt that Ukraine is acting independently in this conflict when Anthony Blinken is the one creating these peace proposals and sending them to Kyiv and Moscow. Clearly, the US has a lot of control and a lot of influence over Ukraine. That is another topic for another day. With the stalemate in diplomatic relations between America and between Russia, with the Americans unable to really escalate this conflict any further with any effectiveness without putting actual boots on the ground, they are at the same time pushing towards more escalation and towards a direct conflict with Russia, despite not having enough missiles to sustain an offensive in Taiwan for a week. Like, I've started to come to this opinion, and that this is just conjecture and me ranting at this point, but I'm convinced that some of these Western analysts, unless they are completely just spineless, they actually have to occupy a different reality in a different universe where Ukraine is winning this conflict. Nothing has happened in Ukraine for the last 8 years. Russian security interests and the promise to not expand NATO further that was made in 1991, none of that stuff happened in their universe. In their universe, this conflict started February 24th, 2022, when Putin woke up one day and decided, oh, I want more land and resources. I'll take it from the Ukrainians now. And according to these people, since that point, the Ukrainians have done nothing but slaughter the entirety of the Russian forces, destroy or capture all their equipment, and yet Ukraine is still going around and begging for more arms, more support, more economic support, and more commitment from the West. Can anybody square those two narratives for me? Anybody? So, I'm going to say I'm going to end the video here. I've already gone on for long enough, some 42 minutes at this point. If you've listened this far, I really appreciate it. If you are opposed to anything I said, I am definitely willing to hash it out, either in the comment section in a bit more of a short form question and answer kind of style, or if I think your comment or the item you're contradicting me on, if that warrants a further bigger discussion, I'll most likely make a YouTube video out of it. I am definitely more than willing to be proven wrong on anything I said here, but in order to do that, you are going to need to bring some pretty ironclad sources, and no sources, not a single source, do not bring me a single source in this argument that says Ukrainian officials say. Okay? This is the first conflict that the US hasn't had their own intelligence on the ground, where they are relying completely on the intelligence agencies of the country they are supporting in a proxy war. Okay? If Ukraine wanted to lie about anything they wanted, if they wanted to say Putin is in the streets of Kyiv, dual-wielding Kalashnikovs, mowing people down, they could say it, and Western outlets would report it as fact. So do not bring me that shit, okay? But other than that, I'm more than willing to have a civil conversation. So again, thank you for watching, and have a gooder.